We should soon become perfect men if every year we extirpated some one vice or imperfection. Thomas à Kempis. Thou shalt not fear them, because the Lord thy God is in the midst of thee, a God mighty and terrible. He will consume these nations in thy sight, by little and by degrees. Deuteronomy 7:21-22. Throughout the history of the Church, there have been two specific devotions that have been recommended as encapsulating the totality of Catholic spirituality. Whether you know it or not, these two devotions pervade every single office, litany, and chaplet you pray. Further, these two devotions are essential to hearing Mass properly, going to confession, and generally carrying out your duty to grow in virtue and defeat vice. The first of these devotions is called mental prayer. In mental prayer, the soul is elevated to God in order to make acts of devotion, consider truth, and resolve to carry out the commandments. If you are interested in learning about mental prayer, I've recently published an old book from a Jesuit priest called A Brief Guide to Mental Prayer According to the Mind of St. Ignatius, linked in the description below. The second of these devotions, and the subject of this video, is called the Particular Examen. This devotion, in various different forms, has always been recommended by spiritual masters in order to overcome vices and build virtues. It has even been recommended among classical authors. St. Jerome and St. Thomas note that authors like Seneca, Plutarch, and Epictetus recommended it to their disciples. This was also common amongst the Church Fathers. Father Rodriguez gives us a summary, noting that, quote, St. Basil, one of the most ancient of those that have made rules for religious persons, ordained that they should every night make this examen. St. Augustine, in his rule, enjoins the same. St. Anthony taught also the same to his followers by his own example. And St. Bernard, St. Bonaventure, St. John Cassian, and generally all the founders of religious orders, as well as all masters of the spiritual life, would have us daily apply ourselves to this exercise. Yet it wasn't until the time of St. Ignatius and his disciples that we received the classical formulation of this practice, which this video will follow. As a note before we continue, I'm not a spiritual director or any sort of master of the spiritual life. I'm a guy who reads books and then communicates what they say to others. Do not trust me, but read them for yourself. Particularly useful are Father Luis de la Palma, a treatise on the Particular Examen of Conscience according to the method of St. Ignatius, Father Alfonso Rodriguez, The Practice of Christian and Religious Perfection, Treatise 7, and Father Belisius's Solid Virtue, Part 2, Chapter 5. Also, before we begin, remember to like, comment, subscribe, and share. If you really enjoy this type of content and would like to thank me, please consider becoming a patron on patreon.com/militantthomas or sending a donation at christianbwagner.com/donate. It really helps me out. Also, I would like to give Unionist Initiative a special shout out for helping with the editing of this video. Make sure to go and subscribe to his channel as well. While I mentioned in the introduction to this video that the traces of the Particular Examen are found throughout every one of the spiritual masters, it is important to emphasize that St. Ignatius's formulation was groundbreaking. He took from his reading of the Desert Fathers, medievals, and other spiritual masters of his day and made something that was ancient yet new. Father González Davila, a 16th century Ignatian master, notes that the Particular Examen has been given to the Jesuits by, quote, the singular grace of our Lord, for the purity of its sons, and to raise workers unmistakable and without reproach and blemish, free not only from the stains of sins, but also from our particular and natural conditions. All other means used by the Jesuits are common to other religious orders and schools of virtue that exist in the Church. Prayer, there are many religious orders that deal with it. General examination also. But the Particular Examen, as discussed here, we do not find in any other. Trace, yes, and foundation of Particular Examen, but the punctuality with which the Jesuits teach it, in no way. End quote. Yet, unfortunately, this devotion is not as frequently emphasized by those who are practitioners of the spirituality of St. Ignatius today. Many, when they hear of the examen, they think of what St. Ignatius calls the general examen. The difference between the two is that the Particular Examen is concerned with extinguishing one particular fault at a time, whereas the general examen overlooks all one's faults and has a more general disposition of thanksgiving for the working of God throughout one's day. Yet for St. Ignatius and the Ignatian masters, the Particular Examen was just as important as the general examen. Father Rodriguez notes that sickness itself, which dispenses with our ordinary hour of mental prayer, dispenses not with our general or particular examens. We must hold that, therefore, for an infallible maxim, that we must never exempt ourselves from it upon any account whatsoever. The spiritual exercises were edited and revised by St. Ignatius throughout his life. It is said that St. Ignatius wrote down the Particular Examen as an aid to the future St. Peter Faber, when, while zealous for the exercises, he could not quite reach the degree of perfection that he desired. Eventually, St. Peter Faber would go on to become one of the crown jewels of the sons of St. Ignatius, and would be regarded by St. Ignatius himself as the greatest teacher of his spiritual exercises. The final form given by St. Ignatius is as follows, quote, "The particular examen consists in 3 exercises, and 2 to examine oneself. The first time is in the morning, immediately on rising, when one ought to propose to guard himself with diligence against the particular sin or defect with which he wants to correct and amend. The second time is after dinner, when one is to ask of God our Lord what he wants, namely grace to remember how many times he has fallen into the particular sin or defect, and to amend himself in future." Throughout this video, we will take what was given by St. Ignatius here and explain it part by part. Here, we are helped by Father Luis de la Palma when he gives the following definition. Quote, "The particular examen is a spiritual contest against some particular fault, and comprises a purpose not to fall, an anxious desire to keep this promise, an examination whether we have fallen, that we may discover whether any correction has been obtained, and to what extent, and that in this manner the fault which most hinders us may be thoroughly uprooted, and the virtue we stand in need of be implanted in our hearts." Here we see that all the parts of the particular examen are given, the matter, form, and final cause of the examen. Thus, this video will be split into 3 parts. First, we will cover the form of the examen, showing what are the various acts that take place in the examen. Second, we will show the matter of the examen, what kind of vice is destroyed and what kind of virtue gained in the examen. Lastly, we will cover the end of the examen, that is, its purpose. To summarize the matter, form, and end, I will briefly explain each one of them. So the form is the resolution as flowing from meditation, which we may split into 4 acts. First, determination to keep the resolution. Second, watchfulness over the resolution. Third, examination whether we have kept this resolution. Fourth, comparison between time periods in which we have sought to keep this resolution. Then the matter of the particular examen is some particular fault we must correct or virtue we must acquire. And the end of the particular examen is to eliminate that particular fault or acquire that virtue that is the matter of the examen by an application of the form of the examen. In this first part of the video, we will cover the form of the examination, which is a resolution as flowing from meditation. Simply, a resolution is merely some act of the will to carry out such and such an act. Thus, if we wake up in the morning and say to ourselves that today we will defeat lust, we are making a resolution to defeat lust. The 4 parts of the form of the particular examen are meant to be the forming and carrying out of this resolution to destroy what is present in the matter, that is, a particular sin. It is also important that this is just not any resolution, but a resolution as flowing from meditation, or we could say a resolution as flowing from mental prayer. Through mental prayer, we not only make certain acts of devotion towards God, but we discover the vices we must destroy, the virtues we must gain, the motives for these acts, and finally we make strong resolutions to these things. This is what distinguishes the particular examen from a merely naturalistic, moralistic, and quasi-Pelagian desire to grow in virtue and fix our defects. As I mentioned, there are 4 acts which constitute the form of the particular examen: determination, watchfulness, examination, and comparison. The first of these, determination, is the purpose to keep such and such a virtue and destroy such and such a vice. In the spiritual exercises, St. Ignatius describes it as follows, quote, "Immediately on rising, when one ought to propose to guard himself with diligence against that particular sin or defect which he wants to correct and amend. This determination is known as the first examen. The first examen is carried out right when you wake up in the morning during your morning prayers. This determination is not some half-hearted wish. It is a declaration of holy war before God against the world, the flesh, and the devil. In this you focus on a single vice or single virtue, and resolve with all your power before God to keep this. There are 4 parts to making a good determination that the spiritual authors outline. First, you say your morning offering yourself and all your actions during this day to God. Second, you consider your past faults, especially against the virtue or vice you are seeking to work on, making an act of contrition. Third, this is the most important part, renew your resolution against the vice you seek to destroy or virtue you wish to establish. In order to make this fervently, it may be helpful to briefly consider the various motives for this resolution, which we will cover in a bit more detail later. Lastly, one must ask for the graces from God to keep this resolution you have made. It is also appropriate here to add prayers to the Blessed Virgin, one's guardian angel, patron saint, and Saint Ignatius, along with saints that are related to your resolution. For example, Saint Thomas Aquinas for chastity. The authors list 5 qualities of a good resolution. First, it must be definite rather than general. For example, it is better to resolve not to overindulge in food quantitatively than simply resolve not to be gluttonous. Second, it must be discreet rather than overly ambitious. For example, it is better to resolve to avoid certain deliberate venial sins than removing all inordinate movements. Third, it must be steadfast. Fourth, it must be humble. Here we seek to follow Father Scopoli's 2 weapons of distrust of self and complete trust in God. Thus, we will not imagine the particular examen to function in a Pelagian sense, but will always rely on constant prayer. Fifth, it must daily increase. That is, the resolution made tends towards the perfection of the virtue or perfect removal of the vice, rather than remaining stagnant. The next 3 parts of the form are meant to be the carrying out of the determination that you have made in the morning. After determination, one must practice watchfulness. Watchfulness simply means that one keeps watch over his actions in order to bring them into conformity with his resolution. This functions in 2 ways. First, when one is tempted. Second, when one has fallen into such and such a sin. When one is tempted, first, we are to supplicate God for the grace to keep our resolution and to ask for the intercession of those saints you prayed to that morning. Second, you are to consider motives. I've mentioned motives a few times in this video already, but haven't clearly laid out what these motives are and how they are formed and affect change. These motives can be more easily described as motivations. These motivations are considerations that move the will to carry out a certain task. In our day-to-day life, we use motivations all the time. If one wishes not to eat a slice of cake, they consider the fact that they need to be healthy. If one doesn't want to wake up and go to work, they consider the fact that their family needs to eat. These motivations function similarly in the spiritual life. Here, through mental prayer and study, we can amass various motivations for carrying out your resolution that you can apply to yourself in times of temptation and recall from time to time throughout your day. The more particular and impactful you can make these motivations, the better. For example, if someone has a devotion to St. Thomas Aquinas and struggles with purity, they may recall St. Thomas Aquinas' victory over the woman of the night in order to strengthen one's resolve. This brings us to the fact that there are 2 types of motivation, general and special. General motivations are motivations that move us to practice virtue in general. For example, considering beatitude does not draw us to any virtue in particular, but only virtue in general. These are very powerful due to their universal scope, but can be less effective for focused battle on a particular vice, which may need to be defeated with a more particular weapon. This more particular weapon are special motivations. These can be more or less general. For example, a motivation against impurity is most general, a motivation against fornication is less general, and a motivation against fornication with this particular woman in my particular state, with my particular interest, is most particular. The more particular the motive, the more powerful it is. This is why not only reading books which list these virtues, but also considerations drawn from mental prayer should be deployed. If you wish to furnish yourself by reading, Venerable Louis of Granada's Sinner's List has lists of both types in abundance. Second, we can also look at watchfulness when one capitulates to such and such a vice. Here it is traditional that one place their fist on their chest and offer a small prayer as a small act of penance whenever they break their resolution. One can also make a short note of this transgression for memory's sake. This act will help with the next 2 parts of the form. both of which are meant to consider whether one has been watchful and vigilant in carrying out one's resolution. The third part is the examination. The examination, from which the whole exercise takes its name, is when we look over our day in order to discover whether we have kept our resolution. Traditionally, this was done at noon and before bed, but often laymen simply do this before bed. It is up to every individual whether to keep the morning and evening model or add in a noon examination as well, but there are many advantages to doing a noontime examination. First, one is better able to recall their instances of transgressions when it is done more frequently. Second, one is able to better motivate the will when it is done with more frequency, so that one does not bite off more than they can chew. For example, if one is addicted to pornography, to resolve to make it without indulging in the desire or the act until lunchtime, and then from lunchtime to bedtime, is a much easier set of goals than resolving to go the entire day. Either way, do what you find best in your state in life. Traditionally, there are 5 parts to an examination. First, ask for light, that you may be able to recall your sins and be able to rise again, bringing forth acts of contrition and renewing your resolve against it. Second, consider your transgressions, going from hour to hour. It is important to note that this second part is not the central part of the examination. Rather, this consideration is 1, in order to have proper material to bring forth good acts of sorrow, and 2, to consider the causes of your sin. Third, as flowing from the second, bring forth all of those sins you have considered, and then think about their wickedness and make acts of contrition for these sins. Fourth, also flowing from the second, one ought to exhort themselves against the sins they have committed and considered under the second point. This involves going back to the causes you considered in your transgressions, not merely the transgressions themselves. This focus on causes will also help you be more ready in your watchfulness. For example, if you struggle with impurity and realize that the sloth that you suffer in the morning by lying in bed is providing an occasion of sin, this can be used as a powerful corrective to exhort yourself towards. Fifth, renew your resolution. Additionally, some also give themselves a small penance in order to help overcome the vice. It might be a certain prayer or a light deprivation, for example, praying an Ave or not putting salt on your next meal, but this is optional. The last part of the form is comparison. In this, you can keep track of how you are going day by day. St. Ignatius suggests you track numerically, counting morning to afternoon, day to day, week to week. For example, you may break a certain vice 7 times in the morning, 5 times in the afternoon, and you compare them and see that you've improved. Or you may compare how you've done last week and see that you have committed the sin 30 times and then see that this week it's 25 times, and then you track it over time. You can also write short notes of how your day went and compare them. Basically, the idea is that you want to be able to see how you are growing from day to day. For 1, encouragement. 2, so that you can identify stagnation of growth, which may require a meeting with a spiritual director, a short retreat, or a re-examination of one's fidelity to the examen. Or 3, so that you can know when you have basically eliminated a certain vice and can move on to another vice. That is it for the form. Now we have to go over the matter of the examen. The matter of the examen is some particular fault we must correct or virtue we must acquire by the application of the form stated above. Thus, if one wishes to fight the vice of lust, lust would be said to be the matter of the particular examen. Let's look at the definition in a bit more detail. Generally speaking, since the examen is meant to destroy sin or to build virtue, thus either sin or virtue is going to be the matter of one's examen. It gets more clarified when we go further and say particular sin or particular virtue. This idea of the examen being particular is where it gets all its strength from. If you were laying siege to a city, you wouldn't go and try to destroy each part of the wall. Rather, you would concentrate all your forces on a single point and place all the power you have against that little point. So you apply the form above, not to sin in general or virtue in general. You take it and apply it to a single little point that you wish to wage a complete war of attrition against, leaving no survivors, salting the fields, and obliterating any memory of your enemy, except one of pure and utter disdain and disgust. We go even further, dividing each virtue into particular parts and each vice into particular parts. attacking one part at a time until we have destroyed the entire thing. Thus, we don't only destroy lust in general, but we may begin with lustful acts, then lustful words, and then finally destroy lustful thoughts. Chapter 5 of Rodriguez and Chapter 13 of De La Palma give example divisions for a number of vices. Here, depending on whether it is a virtue or vice we are speaking of, we can distinguish between a, quote, negative examen, which treats vices, or a, quote, positive examen, which treats virtues. Temporally, the negative examen comes first. For if we are to plant a garden, we must be sure to pull out the weeds that overrun it. Thus, the negative examen is for beginners seeking to destroy vices, and the positive examen is for proficients and perfects who seek to build virtue. But what is the order in which we should destroy vices? Here there is some dispute. Some determine that you ought to find what is called your predominant fault, which is the source and root of other vices, destroying this first and then moving on to others. Others say that the listing of the 7 or 8 deadly sins are actually the order one should follow as a beginner. I will just give some general guidelines that seem common among the authors. The order of matter is quite important. We must be sure that we are building the walls before we build the roof. Our Lord mentions this when he rebukes the Pharisees for straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. We ought to be sure to begin with the more grave and more destructive, and then move on from there. First, defeat mortal sin. This is crucial. If you are not in a state of grace, you cannot grow in grace. So, if you have any habitual sins that are mortal, war against them first. Second, destroy deliberate venial sins that impugn on the obligations that you have to others. This is especially relevant to parents and those in religious orders. For example, if a wife has venial problems with obedience that are causing discord in her family, she needs to work through that first. Third, destroy outward acts before inward acts. Since it is much more difficult to root out inward acts, and inward acts are fueled by outward acts, and inward acts ordinarily are less deliberate and thus less grave, it is most important to begin by destroying outward acts and then moving on to inward acts. Thus, if someone is struggling with fornication, they must root out their fornication rather than attempt to fight the inward motions of their heart towards lust. Fourth, vices can either be of a carnal nature, such as gluttony, lust, etc., or a spiritual nature, pride, vanity, etc. One ought to destroy carnal vices before spiritual vices. Not only are carnal vices easier to destroy since they more immediately rely on external acts, but also they tend to do more damage, more often being of a grave nature. Beyond this, many authors propose that gluttony is at the root and source of other vices. This leads them to give the following list for beginners. First, gluttony. Second, lust. Third, covetousness. Fourth, anger. Fifth, melancholy. Sixth, sloth. Seventh, vanity and pride. One may read more about these in St. John Cassian's Institutes. Father de la Palma in Chapter 13 divides each of the vices in the order of deeds, words, and thoughts as well. Yet we ought to remember that this list is quite flexible in its details. Father de la Palma comments, different persons are differently constituted. There is also a diversity of time and occasion. As in different individuals, the same passions do not predominate. So even in the same person, does the same passion vary with the times, occasions, employments, and dispositions? Our enemy narrowly watches all these changes in order to get our souls back into his clutches. This being the case, we must make the stoutest defense where the attack is the sharpest. The temptation we are most liable to will show on what our examen should mostly be made. It is important to recognize that all of the vices listed up until now are for beginners. To fight these vices is part of the purgative way, which precedes the illuminative and unitive ways. Further, as we mentioned above, this is simply the negative examen, which is before the positive examen. Some authors also recommend certain virtues that are central to each one of the stages of perfection. I'll give the recommendations of Father de la Palma here. First, the beginner must cultivate solitude. Second, the proficient must cultivate humility and poverty of spirit. Third, the perfect must, quote, by prayer and contemplation deepen the union and familiarity of their souls with God. It is also possible that one simply discern by prayer which virtue one ought to build due to the imperfections they struggle with, the attractions of grace, and the needs of their state. The last question that needs to be asked is how long we ought to remain in defeating a certain aspect of a vice or building a certain aspect of a virtue. For it can be quite dangerous to go from vice to vice rapidly, only superficially destroying this or that vice. Father Rodriguez gives us guidance on this matter, saying, quote, "We must fight it till we find we have got so much ground and advantage over our enemy that as soon as he dares show himself, we are presently able to overcome him and subject him to reason, so that we must not stay until the passion is quite extinguished, until we feel no repugnance at all. For this we must never expect in this life. It is sufficient that the passion we propose to ourselves to overcome gives us not much trouble, in that it is of so little hindrance to us, that as soon as it rises we are able easily and certainly to overcome it, and then we may attack other enemies, and take another subject for our examen. It is not necessary, therefore, that we should wait till the vice is so dead in us that we feel nothing at all of it. It is sufficient that we have so weakened and so disarmed it that it is no hindrance to us in the performance of what conduces to our salvation. Lastly, we can look at the end of the particular examen. Here we can give a brief synopsis of the entire video in one sentence. The end of the particular examen is to eliminate that particular fault or acquire that virtue that is the matter of the examen by an application of the form as expressed above, for the glory of the Blessed Trinity and for the salvation of our souls.